Hello, hello. Welcome to the Global Citizen Therapy Podcast, the podcast for women of color who are daughters of immigrants to feel seen, heard, and validated. My name is Nancy Diaz, and I am a trauma-informed therapist, speaker, and your podcast host today. And now, let's jump into today's episode. Okay, let's get into this. I always love to say that I have a mental health podcast sprinkled with a little bit of social justice in there, and this is definitely one of those episodes. So today we're talking about something that I've been wanting to talk about on the podcast for a while, and that is the fetishization of women of color. So yes, very related to this season where we're talking about sex, sexuality, and sexual health. And so yeah, let's get into it. I've been doing a bit of research and yeah, part of me was like really excited to do this episode. And another part of me was like kind of dreading, like even just doing a quick Google search on this because I knew that it would go into some dark, kind of depressing places. So I'm going to try my best not to be a bummer here, but just to really kind of educate because I think that so many people don't even know that this is a thing. And yes, that's including women of color themselves. I have met, and I know that I was this way too, that I didn't even realize. And I kind of took it as a compliment, when I'd get comments such as, oh, you're erotic, or like, oh, sorry, not erotic, exotic, or you're spicy, or like, oh, like all these comments, right? And so there are different stereotypes, right, for different ethnicities. But yeah, let's get into it, starting first with Latinos because it's Hispanic Heritage Month. Okay, yes, spicy, exotic, just there's also this kind of, yes, crazy Latina. There's also this kind of slutty, easy, just will be eager to please kind of stereotype as well. So there's the big butt stereotype as well, which I found it really interesting watching JLo's documentary last year, I think it was, where, yeah, I mean, I always just thought like, wow, like JLo, so beautiful, right? And yes, like everyone loves her big booty. And I mean, I do too. And I was like, yeah, like I never gave it more than a second thought. And it was until watching her documentary that I realized, like, holy crap, like that is yeah, that's wrong of me to even be perpetuating that stereotype. And when someone mentions J-Lo, and the first thing that they think of is her butt, like, and I don't challenge that, and other people around me don't challenge that. Yeah, it just reduces her to that's all she is, when in reality she's so much more, such a powerhouse, right? And yeah, like I think about that now and I'm like, wow, her talking about those challenges that she had to overcome, right? And yeah, about how when she was just starting out in the industry, she didn't have the body type that anyone else in Hollywood had, right? And in the music industry had. And so, yeah, it was something that was new and exciting. And yeah, definitely, I think the fetishization started kind of there. I mean, not that it started there. Historically, it's always been a thing, right? But at least, for her, yeah, she had to, as soon as she made it big and people started recognizing her just based on her butt, yeah, it was what she was reduced to, right? So, yeah, I think we have to start looking at these things and saying, like, wow, okay, something that can be, you know, a compliment can actually have very harmful impacts, very harmful roots, and sometimes even harmful intentions, right? Not always. Some people don't really mean any harm, but yeah, I mean, just diving into it, like, yeah, it's rooted in racism. And I think for me on my journey, I think it wasn't until right after, the Black Lives Matter movement really started, after George Floyd's murder, that, there were all of a sudden more posts and things to read, right? And I remember reading a post that was talking about, if you think that you have a type and you say, I don't date Black men, or I don't date Latina women because that they're just not my type. and actually looking at that for what it is, right? That, oh, okay, that's some racial bias there, right? And I had never seen it that way. I had never thought of it that way. And actually, that post actually made me think, like, wow, why is it that I've never dated a Black man, And yeah, and actually like that actually forced me to get like really real with myself and sit with that uncomfortable feeling of like, wow, well, you know what? I think there was a little part of me that even when I'd start to, in high school, like I had a crush on this Black guy, right? I was friends with. And yeah, I just remember thinking like, okay, like this is like a nice kind of like fantasy to have, but I can never actually do anything about it because, like I can't bring a Black guy home. Like my parents, they wouldn't approve. And, like what would my family say? Like they already, because yeah, like when we talk about colorism, which we'll get into a little bit more, but yeah, there was definitely colorism in my family. And yeah, I think in most Latino families, and yeah, of course, not limited just to Latino families, but yeah, I got those comments all the time, right? Of, I was called prieta or negra, which just means like dark skinned, right? Prieta is kind of like not as bad as negra. Negra just means Black woman, right? But prieta kind of means like dark skinned woman. And so I had a love-hate relationship with being called that, especially by people in my family, because I just thought like I know that they say it and they mean it with a lot of love and it's kind of like a little pet name and they think that they're being cute, but I also could tell, from a young age that I was like, but it's not a good thing to be dark skinned, and if you're dark skinned, well, you're not as pretty as someone who's light skinned. And so I was always kind of annoyed when people would call me that in my family. And even my dad called me negra on the phone when he greeted me. And that was just about a month ago. And I was like instantly annoyed. And I just kind of questioned him like negra. And but yeah, he had no idea, like he doesn't know this journey that I've been on, right? And so he's like, yeah. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not gonna go into the whole thing right now because this is gonna be a quick call and I gotta get to the point, right? Of what I was calling for. But yeah, it's interesting, right? So we have to start to look at and examine all of these things. And yeah, it can be really uncomfortable. But yeah, like I've seen, on these dating apps sometimes. And yeah, I think all women of color kind of know that, oh, well, that's kind of a red flag, right? If, you see that in all of his pictures, he's, with Asian women, right? Or with Latina women, or, like all these things. And even like, yeah, like there's so many harmful like stereotypes and so many harmful like examples of fetishization being kind of glorified, right? And being seen as normal and okay in so many popular TV shows, right? So, I mean, even if you think about like one of my favorite shows that I always kind of think is like, well, this is kind of like the least problematic popular TV series out there right now, like that so many people watch, right? Brooklyn Nine-Nine. But if you think about like Jake and Amy and like who did he date before that, that Latina lawyer, and even when Charles pointed out like, oh, that's your type, right, Jakey? And he's just like, shh, and but interesting, right? That yeah, that needed to be silenced partially because he was embarrassed and didn't want Amy to know that. But also, I think like, oh, was it also that he knows that there's something wrong with, having that type, right? And only dating Latina women, when he's white. Like, yeah, there is, it's not always the case, right? But yeah, you have to kind of examine like why is it that you only date, people from a certain race or ethnicity. So yes, let's dive into it a little bit more, right? So there's, you know, really harmful terms such as yellow fever, right? To describe when someone really wants to have sex with Asian women, for example. And yes, very harmful. And, especially with so many Asians being targeted after COVID. And yeah, so the problem with this is that when women of color are fetishized, they're dehumanized, right? And so when you call it something like fever, right? And yellow, like just both of those terms just, ugh, right? And yet it becomes such a normal thing, right? Of like, oh, like he always dates Asian women, and that's seen as like okay, like maybe that's fine. And I think there's also kind of the belief within our communities, right? That like, oh wow, like you have a white guy, like you have a white partner, like that you're moving up in the world, right? And I think so many, our family members might actually want that for us, right? Especially if it means that we will have the lighter skinned babies or babies with more Eurocentric features, or be able to assimilate more into Western culture, like all of these things. And yeah, sometimes based on, income, class, like all of these things, right? But yeah, definitely kind of have to look at, yeah, the whole, oh man, there's just so much history, right? With racism and fetishization that I think that it's just not talked about enough. Like even a Google search doesn't bring up, I think, nearly enough of what needs to be said on there, right? On this topic. So there's colorism, but there's, like I said, featureism, right? When you want more Eurocentric features, but there's also texturism, right? And wanting to have or discriminating against a certain hair type, right? And hair texture. So, yes, there's all these things, there's all these layers. But yeah, when you drill down to the very root of it, when we fetishize certain groups, then we're slowly dehumanizing them, right? And that's exactly kind of what was happening during slavery times, is that, African women were said to have had sex with apes, and African men were said, and this stereotype has still kind of persisted, right? That they were very large. And so yes, it's a problem. It's definitely something that it dehumanizes, both men and women in this context, right? But yes, I think especially, with women, it's a big problem because they were seen as a sexual commodity, right? And something that they could just be used, exploited, and then thrown away, right? Because white men never had any issues with owning Black men and women, but yeah, they didn't see them as human, and yet they still didn't have any issues raping Black female slaves, right? And yeah, and that's where kind of it started, right? Of like, okay, they're not human, but look, they have a big butt, and to even put like Black women on display, and to perform like very invasive, horrible like exams, to see kind of if they were breeders, if they were, going to be able to reproduce enough, if they were going to be, like sexually active enough, like all these things, right? If they were sexually healthy so that they could, continue reproducing, like all of this, like highly problematic, right? And so when we think about like, okay, yes, I am attracted to Black women. Yes, I am attracted to Latina women, to Asian women, to whatever. We have to think about like the roots as well, right? Because it definitely goes a lot further. And yeah, the language that we use as well, right? So when we think of like what comes first to mind when you think of Latina, so we mentioned, spicy and that kind of thing, but also even like what do we see in songs and the media, like Mamacita, and like oh my God, like we're always supposed to want to be, dressing a certain way, right? Like in very revealing clothing. And then we get fetishized even more, especially if we, want to honor our culture and, wear something like big hoops or bright lipstick. I mean, to the point that every time that I think about wearing a bright colored lipstick, I stop myself because I know that I will stand out, and I know that I may be fetishized, and I know that I may, yeah, like there might be more of a risk that I will experience racism or discrimination if I dress or do my hair or makeup in a certain way that is more Latina, right? And so, yeah, there's tons to think about here. There's tons to heal from. There's tons to unpack. I know for me, like it's only been, I think in the last 2 years that I finally, like now when you see me, like I always wear my hair naturally and I've just learned to embrace my wavy hair. But for so long, so long, I hated my natural wavy hair. I wanted to straighten it. I wanted to chemically straighten it. I wanted to look, as Eurocentric as possible. When I was younger, I tried to stay out of the sun as much as possible. That's kind of the messaging that I definitely got from my parents and still do get, especially from my mom, is, don't be in the sun too often because you're going to get really dark and, you're going to get really negra and you're going to be confused for black. And that would be, in their minds, like the worst thing if someone confused me for being black. Right. And like, how harmful is that? And I know that they have good intentions in some ways with that, right? That they don't want me to experience racial violence or racial discrimination or anything like that just because I have darker skin. So they're trying to protect me in that way, right? But it's also, of course, anti-Black sentiment, and like that's highly problematic, right? And so yeah, there's just all these things, right? These added kind of layers. But yeah, definitely, when we're thought to like, oh, you're supposed to, speak in Spanish and call, the man papi. And, like that to me, I've never understood. I'm like, I don't understand that. Where does that even come from? I would have to do more research and get back to you on another episode on this. But if you know, feel free to drop me a DM on Instagram and let me know where does that come from. But to me, I'm like, wow, no, I'm not gonna, like, to me, that's kind of like red flag right there. If a guy ever tells me, like, we're in bed and he tells me, like, oh, I want you to call me papi. I'm like, no, hang on, wait, I'm shutting this down like right now. Like that is definitely not a turn on. And I was like, and usually what I tell them, I was like, why? Why do you want me to call you that? I was like, that's literally what I called my dad when I was growing up. And I literally had one Aussie guy. He's like, oh, I don't even, does that mean dad? I didn't know that that's what that meant. No, don't call me that then. That's weird. And I was like, yeah, okay. I was like, wow, that is wild, right? So yes, pretty problematic. But I mean, yeah, I think a lot of us have experienced that, right? That they all of a sudden want us to speak, in another language because, yeah, it's exotic and it's hot. And yeah, then, yeah, that definitely adds to us being fetishized, right? And sometimes, I've definitely like in the past, like gotten into that. Now I think I know a little bit too much where I like question these things and I'm like, hang on, like I don't think I'm into that. Like I think this is gonna be a problem if you want me, to speak in Spanish to you and like all these things, which by the way, I'm really curious to hear how many of you like bicultural women out there like who are listening, how many of you actually don't know how to dirty talk in your parents' mother tongue? Because I actually don't. And that's actually I always have found that really interesting because I'm like, yeah, that's kind of where I do definitely feel more American than Mexican because I'm like, there are some things that I'm like, I just don't know how to say. I don't know how to talk about climate change. I don't know how to talk dirty in Spanish. So I'm like, yeah, that's always interesting when, I've had like guys in the past ask me to do that and I'm like, no, no, that's not gonna happen. And I think part of me even back then like shut it down because I'm like, that's weird. Like don't ask me to do that. That's not right. That doesn't feel right. Something about that feels like ugh. Um, and then secondly, because I didn't know how to. But yeah, I mean, just kind of a funny little side note. So let me know. Feel free to message me. I might do a poll on IG on that as well, because I'm just kind of curious because I'm sure I'm not the only one. Um, when I was having this conversation with a friend a couple years ago about she was asking me like what language I pray in. And I told her that I wasn't religious anymore. But when, I was growing up Catholic, I said, oh, well, always we would pray in Spanish. And I said, and if I were to pray right now, yeah, I would pray in Spanish because I only know how to pray in Spanish. And she said, yeah, that's super interesting. And she said, like, we were even talking about like what language you talk to younger siblings in, right? And we were both bilingual. And so we were just kind of comparing notes, right? And she said, like, oh, I also pray like in my parents' mother tongue. And I also like talk to like the youngest sibling, like in my parents' mother tongue, but the other ones I talked to them in English. And I was like, wow, I thought like in my family we're just really weird, that I was like, I don't know how that happened, but somehow like all of us just kind of, I think, agreed like, oh, the little one is the most likely to lose the Spanish, so we're just going to talk to her only in Spanish, even though when she went to school, like, she needed to know English and she learned English, right? So yeah, anyway, interesting side note. You always know that I go off on side tangents as usual, but yeah, going back to all this wording, right? Wording matters so much, but yeah, even the way that we think about, women of color, and when we fetishize them, and even when we tend to think of them as sluts, as easy, as shameless, all these things, right? Very problematic. Even when we start to think about the crazy Latina stereotype, like all these things, right? And yeah, I mean, the infantilization, right, is also like such a problem. And I think I've seen that, mostly with East Asians, mostly seen that happen, right? But also, like, I think for me, like, I definitely, and I might do another episode on this, and go more into this kind of whole concept. But yeah, like the way that some parents try to keep you, like keep you their baby, right? And I think it's their way of trying to protect us from the world. And they kind of think like, oh, if we just, keep doing pigtails in their hair and putting like bright pink colors on them and just keep them as our little girls, and they will never grow up and they will never have to experience the horrors of the world and all these things, right? And yeah, it could be because they missed out on their own childhoods. It could be because yeah, they missed out, they didn't get to have that. But it could also be because they've not had an easy adulthood, and maybe childhood was, the best memories that they had, and so they just want to keep us there for as long as possible. So I know that my mom definitely did that with me, and has done that with has tried to do that with my sisters, has been more successful with some of us than others. But yeah, it's interesting as well, right? But yeah, of course, like, I remember when I moved to Australia, and all of a sudden, like, everyone here was wearing a school uniform, and I was like, wow, like, I've seen this like in movies, but I didn't know that this was still a thing, and it kind of seemed like I had gone back in time or something. Because where I'm from in Phoenix, like, yeah, like, I had to wear a uniform in middle school from 6th to 8th grade. And I know that, there were some high schools where you would have to wear a uniform, but it was very, I think, unlikely, in most schools in Arizona, that you had to wear a uniform, unless you were kind of in elementary school or in middle school. And then in high school, they let you wear what you want, right? But it was interesting that, yes, we had a skirt option with our uniform, but yeah, we could always wear pants if we wanted to, right? And yeah, and then the skirts were pretty like long, like, nothing sexy, nothing pleated, nothing that you would think like, oh, this is the skirt that, a girl wears in Pornhub or something, right? So yes, very interesting when I moved here, and all of a sudden the uniform was the plaid, like, pleated skirt, right? And I was like, whoa. And then they had the long stockings as well, and the shoes, and it was just all very much like, I feel like I've only seen this in porn or like in movies where, like, we're talking about like back in the day. And I was like, wow, this is interesting. And I immediately, my first thought was like, how many more of these young girls are being fetishized because of this uniform, right? And then the sad reality is that you see a little girl of color in this uniform, and yeah, unfortunately, she's more likely to experience sexual violence. Because yeah, that's the other thing that's where it got dark when I started researching about the fetishization of women of color, is that yes, we're more likely to experience sexual violence because of this whole dehumanization process, right? And so the more that we get objectified and reduced down to just big butts, or whatever features are seen as attractive, whether it's the eyes, whether it's the butt, whether it's the big lips or the boobs or whatever it is, right? But yeah, we're reduced to that and only that, and seen as less human. And all of a sudden, yeah, there's also all these stereotypes that we enjoy violence, that we like it rough, that we are there to please, and that we're good in bed, and that we're freaky, and all these things, right? And yeah, also, that we're shameless, that we, will dress in a very provocative way. And, I think there are studies that show, I remember reading one, it was a while back now, but said that, yeah, women of color are more likely to be told that, you were asking for it when they do experience sexual violence. So yeah, it is very, very dark. And I think there's, also the fact that, yeah, people see us as, dangerous and wild sometimes. And, even this whole myth, back in slavery times, of the African women had sex with apes. It was meant to dehumanize, but it was also kind of meant to perpetuate the stereotype of, like, oh, Africans are uncivilized, and African women definitely are uncivilized, and they are just non-Christian, or whatever it was, back then, that they don't have any values, they don't have any morals, they will have sex with anyone, they're not picky, like all of these stereotypes, right, being perpetuated and are still perpetuated to this day, right? So I came across an interesting study that said that Pornhub reported in 2017 that it was interesting, like the categories, right? So Japanese went up to the top 20, became the number one, right? And Asian went up to the top 20. And also interesting search terms. So rough sex and interracial went up by 104%. And so what does that tell us? That tells us right away, right? That people want to watch women of color being subjected to violence, right? And so how often is it that women of color are being subjected to violence and sexual violence just for the male gaze, for male pleasure, usually white male pleasure, right? Yeah, it's pretty gross when you think about it that way. Unfortunately, we do have like research now that kind of shows us that, yeah, I mean, even if a woman of color goes missing, like we know, right? Now that it actually has a name, right? The missing white women syndrome. Is that what it's called? I can't even remember the name of the actual term. There's a term for it now. There's a term for it because now we have studies that show us, plus we've seen it, right? It's been a pattern, for decades, that yes, when a white woman goes missing, the whole country will be watching the news, glued to their TVs, making sure that that white woman is found. And yet, women of color and Indigenous women go missing all the time at much higher rates. And yet, it's such a struggle to get in front of a news camera, to get any kind of momentum or hype about, like, let's find this person, let's make sure they're safe, let's make sure that they are found. Nothing, right? And so I'll share with you like a quick story that my friend and I went hiking a couple weeks ago here in Sydney, well, like outside of Sydney. We took a train there, and when we got there, she was the one who had planned it, right? And when we got there, I said, "Oh, like this is where the hike starts." Okay, we got off the train, the hike started. I said, "Great, how long is it?" She said, "Oh, it's about like 4Ks or whatever she said, right?" And I said, "Okay, great. Is there a train station like when this trail ends?" Because sometimes there is, right? And she said, "Oh no, there's not." But I looked into it, and I think there's a bus stop not that far, so we can just catch the bus, worst case scenario. And I said, "Okay." And then we finished the hike. We ended up going slow and hiking for most of the day. And then when we get to the end, we realized that actually, no, the closest bus stop was a 2.5 hour walk away. And it was starting to get dark, and both of our phones were starting to get low on battery. And so we decided to start walking, but also to try to catch a ride with someone to the closest bus stop or to the closest train station, because it was going to get dark on us and we were walking on the side of the road. And it just, yeah, we didn't want to end up in an unsafe situation. And it was interesting that so many cars went past us. And yeah, and I know, like, my friend who's Indian didn't understand like why like cars weren't stopping for us. And I, finally like told her, I was like, we're in a very white area, and the people might look at just our skin tone and unfortunately confuse us with Aboriginal, or whether they confuse with Aboriginal or not. But I said they might think that we are dangerous, and so they're not stopping for us. Because I think she was the one that finally, after an hour and a half of so many cars just going past us and not even slowing down to check on us, nothing, finally she asked, like, "Do you think they would stop for us if we were white?" And that's when I was like, yeah, unfortunately I do know kind of the stats on that, and I know that yes, it's way more likely that they would have stopped if we were white. And I didn't want to scare her more by sharing with her the stats that I know, that also are that if something happened to us, there is way less of a chance that anyone would come and look for us. But if we were white, then yes, like, people would have stopped for us and people would have looked for us if something had happened, right? So it's things like this that are like really heavy, to say out loud, to share. And sometimes it is a burden, like knowing what I know. And yeah, sometimes I do think like, oh God, I don't even want to share this stuff. Like, sometimes ignorance is bliss, but at the same time, like, fortunately, we gotta educate ourselves, and we gotta be, alert, and we gotta make sure that other women of color know these things and are alert and are doing, what little we can to protect ourselves and also to protect each other, right? Because when we start to call out, fetishization and racism and discrimination and all of these things, any kind of harmful behavior that we see, even if it's not toward us, but toward someone else, then yeah, the world slowly becomes a better place, right? And it's hard and you can't always do it. But if you feel like you have the capacity to call something out, then yeah, I say call it out, because there's just so much, right? I mean, we're hypersexualized for sure, meaning that people think that we like to have sex all the time, that we have a super high libido, that we're just down all the time, right? And that, yeah, and definitely, I think the stereotype is that, like, for Latinas, that we love to go down on guys, that we just are there to please, right? And I know, with other ethnicities, it's kind of the same thing with like Indian and Arab women, that it's, yeah, you're submissive, right? Based on your culture, based on your religion or whatever, you're meant to be submissive. And so yeah, so that's why I think a lot of, one thing that I was reading, from like a woman's experience, and she says, and I quote her, she said that a white man told her, "You're Arab, you aren't supposed to do that." And yeah, and he was talking about that she didn't want to be submissive. And that's what he said to her. And it's just, it's wild sometimes, the things that we hear white men say, that you kind of like are in shock and you don't even know what to say. I had this experience, I think 2 weeks ago, maybe a week ago or 2 weeks ago, when I was at a bar in Sydney and I was just getting a drink, and I just decided to chat with the guy next to me since we were both waiting on drinks. And I don't know, I think all I said was hello, and he picked up on my American accent right away. And this is something that I hate when people do this, right? Because I feel like sometimes I can't even, like, I may have wanted to say one thing, right? but I can't even get a word in edgewise because as soon as they hear my American accent, they right away like want to steer the direction, and in this way that I can usually tell by their arrogant tone, I'm like, I'm not gonna like this conversation, right? And no, I did not like the conversation because right away he thought that it'd be cool to start bragging to me about how many US cities he'd been to, which was like 5, and it was the main ones. And I think I'd been to all of them. So I was like, I don't know how that's a brag. Like, I don't know if I'm supposed to be impressed by this, or but you could tell that he was trying to be showy and it kind of tell me that he had enough money to go to the US and travel around these 5 cities and whatever. But I was just like so unimpressed. But anyway, I was just, I guess to be polite, I was there like stuck there waiting for my drink. So I was like, oh, Vegas, like, yeah, like Vegas is a cool city, right? And I never actually know what to say when people just mention the cities that they've been to because I'm like, okay, I don't know really what to say to that. Um, and then he said, oh, yeah, like Vegas was great. The prostitutes are really great. And right away, I was just kind of like in shock that this guy that I just met 2 seconds ago said that to me. And what I kind of reminded myself, like, I was like, okay, well, like that kind of thing is legal in Australia. So, like, even though it's not legal in the US, like, I guess it's like more normal for him to just say that out loud, I guess. And but then it got worse because then he, without me saying anything or responding to him in any way, he then says, oh, but don't worry, like I didn't pay for any of them. And I was just like, oh my God, oh my God. Because right away, my thoughts were, okay, knowing what I know, that unfortunately, most prostitutes or sex workers are, women of color. I was like, oh my God, he just exploited women of color and admitted that to me, even though you can see clearly that I'm a woman of color myself and I'm American. And I'm just thinking about like all the things that women of color go through. And just by the way, because I know that people listen to this podcast and they have all different levels of education around these topics. So I will just put in the disclaimer for those who don't know. So the reason that there are more sex workers that are women of color is not because we have higher libidos. It's not because we're easy or shameless or sluts or sexual commodities or any of the things that I've mentioned in this podcast. That's not your proof of like, oh wow, see there you go. Like that's the proof. No, it's actually because of systemic racism, right? It's often because, yeah, women of color, yeah, have less income, less resources. They have, yeah, so many barriers to access food and education and just even the basic necessities. And because there's just so many systems in place to put us down that, yes, sometimes women of color turn to sex work because of that. Not always, of course, of course. And I think what I've seen in Australia, that is very different from, the culture in the US is that, yeah, sex workers here, it's very different. Sex workers here, I think a lot of them do it by choice, at least the ones I've met, right? And they feel empowered and they feel like it's not taboo and they can, talk about it more freely, not as freely as, I think men who, you know, buy sex, but it's different. I think I've noticed the culture is a bit different. But yeah, I think in the US it is kind of more out of necessity, right? And I think definitely, there's a lot of trans sex workers as well. And yeah, unfortunately, that's not always out of choice. Most oftentimes I'd say it's not out of choice. It's just you have to do that to survive, right? And that's kind of what you see. And yeah, I love that we're kind of starting to change the narrative a little bit, and even instead of saying prostitute, we say sex worker or sex work. And, even the language that we use really helps, right? And even the way that we think about it, the way we talk about it more, like all of these things are slowly changing and, slowly becoming better. And I think there's more awareness and therefore more resources, for sex workers. um, I actually would love to have a sex worker on the podcast. So if anyone knows of someone who would like to be interviewed on the podcast and tell us actually what it's like, feel free, send them my way. But yeah, I mean, it's anyway, I thought I'd share because yeah, it's not always a choice, and it doesn't prove any kind of point that we are, a certain way or anything like that. And also on the other end, like yeah, like what I've been talking about, like up to this point, is being for us being empowered in our sexuality, in our sexual identity, and to take care of ourselves, and our sexual well-being, our sexual health. That's huge because I think for so many of us, we've grown up with a lot of shame, a lot of stigma. It's something that's so taboo. It's something that's not talked about. It's something that we don't learn about. And then when we do learn about it, we usually learn about it through friends who don't know much more than we do, or we learn about it through porn. And yeah, and what do we see in porn? We see other women of color like ourselves, like, oh, well, everything that I'm seeing in porn says that Latinas or whoever likes rough sex. So I think I'm supposed to like rough sex, and I think even when I was younger, I was like, okay, I think I'm supposed to really enjoy going down on a man. And I think I'm supposed to be good at it. And because I'm Latina, I'm supposed to be freaky, and I'm supposed to, want to experiment, and like I just had all these sexual scripts, right? If you listen to the first episode of this podcast, we talked about sexual scripts. And I think, yeah, that's part of it, right? Like, what are some of the things that you learned, that you internalize, that you think, like, okay, this is how it's supposed to be? I am this, right? If I'm a gay man, I am supposed to want sex all the time. If I am a Latina woman, I need to be really good in bed, and I need to have a big butt and wear the hoop earrings, like, and speak Spanish, and talk dirty in Spanish. Like, what are some of these sexual scripts that you've internalized? I encourage you to try to actually think about, like, what are all the sexual scripts, and which ones do you want to let go of? Where do those come from? Like, asking yourself all these reflection questions can be really helpful so that you can actually decide, like, okay, who am I really? And who is it that I've maybe become because society told me that I needed to be this way, right? And I think even for me, like in recording this episode and in even saying all these things, I think I'm going to take my own advice and continue to do this work, because I think, yeah, there's still some things that I'm like, yes, I do, love that I've become this like sex positive person, that I'm, not ashamed anymore of exploring, of my own sexual identity, of, having had different experiences, all these things. But yeah, at the same time, I do kind of wonder, like, yeah, what else is kind of still there that I need to work through? What sexual scripts am I still kind of haven't let go of? Maybe I'm still kind of perpetuating some stereotypes. Like, it's a journey, right? So we're always trying to improve. And yeah, I think I will just end with talking about if you do feel like you have been shamed or even bullied for becoming, too whitewashed, or, for being too ethnic, whether you're too much of this or not enough of this, I will just kind of encourage you to even explore it through this lens, right? Of like, okay, well, who is telling me that I don't look ethnic enough, right? That I'm not Latina enough, or that I'm not South Asian enough, or whatever it is, right? Like, who's telling me that? And if it's a white person, like, what are those intentions there, right? And if it's someone from my own culture, which I think is usually more the case, like, what's at the root of that? Is it colorism? Is it featureism? Is it texturism? Is it something else? Like, what is at the root of that? Like, why are they telling me that I'm too much of this or not enough of that? Like, where does it come from? And is it helpful to me? Is it harmful? I think most often, if someone's telling me that you're too much of this or not enough of that, of course there's exceptions, but usually, like, you have to be who you are. You have to be who you are and just own that. Own your dual identity. Own, your skin tone. I know that it's a process. I might even do a whole episode, I think, on colorism and on skin tone, because I think, like, that's been a big journey for me. And I'm happy to kind of share, like, where I'm at with that and where it started and all these things, because I think I've kind of mentioned it here or there on other episodes. But yeah, I know it's something that we struggle with so much. And I mean, we talked about like texturism and like the texture of someone's hair, right? But we're talking about the hair on their head. But I know for so many brown girls, there's also, like facial hair and body hair and like all these things that we struggle with low self-esteem because of that, because of body image and not having a certain body type and even the way that we dress or don't dress. And there's all this, right? There's all these kind of cultural rules of what you're supposed to do. And I think for women, for sure, for men as well, with culture, but for women especially, like there's all these unspoken rules and then spoken rules as well. So yeah, just want to encourage you to kind of be kind to yourself. If someone is telling you like you need to do this or do that and they're perpetuating stereotypes, all these things, right? So just notice that and just examine it, reflect, analyze, and do your own kind of inner work. Do some journaling around this, talk to a therapist about this. It's a lot to unpack. It's heavy to unpack, and it's definitely a load to carry that isn't light. And yeah, the reality is it's not always great. The outcome isn't always great. So yeah, I think for us to kind of heal, like, yeah, being in community, really great. And, empowering each other, advocating for ourselves. If you haven't taken the Breaking Taboos workshop yet, I have a free workshop for immigrant daughters, especially, and it's called Breaking Taboos, Communicating About Sex with Confidence as Immigrant Daughters. And that's what I encourage you to do as well, right? Because, yeah, communicating about sex with confidence, once you learn how to do that, like it can show up in all different ways of your life. But I think, yeah, communicating about sex with confidence, we mostly talked about, communicating boundaries and desires and things like that. But yeah, you can definitely apply that even when you do feel like you're being fetishized, right? When someone asks you to speak in a language that you're not even maybe that comfortable speaking in, right? When they ask you to maybe even wear your hair a certain way or wear certain clothing that maybe perpetuates a stereotype or all these things, right? Like having that confidence, right? To be able to communicate and, whether it's calling out or calling in or, just saying without explaining, like, no, you know what, I'm not in the mood anymore, or like, whether you shut it down or you change, you flip the script or whatever it is, right? But it's about becoming confident, it's becoming empowered and saying, okay, this is what I like, this is what I don't, this is what I want, this is what I don't want. Yeah, figuring out what your needs are and then learning how to communicate them. Easier said than done, but definitely possible and definitely a journey that's worth going on because, yeah, like I said, once you can do that in the bedroom, I mean, that's hard, right? Once you can do that in the bedroom, then you can pretty easily do it in other places, workplace, with family, like it'll just show up everywhere, right? So yes, and check out the link in the description of this episode if you want to take that free workshop. It's an hour long. I did it with a sexologist who's a Latina as well. And yes, we talk about some of these things, some of the challenges that we have and in immigrant families and just the taboo of it all, right? The stigma of it all. And yeah, it's a great workshop. So if you haven't checked that out yet, make sure that you do. I will try to remember as I kind of continue these episodes to remind you all, because I know not everyone listens to every episode. So yes, definitely check that out. But yeah, I will leave it there for now. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I will see you all next week. Bye. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. As always, I am here to be open, honest, and vulnerable with you because you are not alone. If you want to support this podcast, please make sure to leave a review so others can find it as well. If you're interested in working with me, you can find me at www.globalcitizentherapy.com. And if you'd like to heal your relationship with self-care and learn more about how to find the type of soul care that works for you, you can find the link to my workshop in the description of this podcast episode. Thank you again and see you next time.